The only time Chrysler decided to build an actual supercar, it got literally sabotaged from outside the country. One of the most outstanding concept supercars America has ever produced, with mind-blowing performance metrics that could beat almost any other car, got mysteriously shut down and thrown away by a foreign entity. This is the story of the Chrysler ME412. In 2004, the North American International Auto Show that took place in Detroit was, for the most part, exactly what people expected. The early 2000s were a specific era for American car design. It was a time of futuristic designs, but also family-oriented vehicles. If you walked into a Chrysler dealership in 2004, you were greeted by the Pacifica, the PT Cruiser, and the Sebring. These were cars designed for school runs and suburban commutes. They were functional, conservative, and, to be frank, unexciting. Except maybe for the PT Cruiser. Then the lights dimmed. When the silk sheet was pulled back, the audience saw something that looked like it had been stolen from a secret space hangar. Low-slung, incredibly wide and draped in carbon fibre and chrome, the Chrysler ME412 looked like a fever dream. It was a mid-engine supercar with a quad-turbocharged V12 engine. The immediate reaction from the press was a mix of awe and skepticism. In the automotive world, there is a long history of vaporware, concept cars that are nothing more than fiberglass shells with no engines, designed to hit headlines before being tucked away in a warehouse forever. This is the definition of a halo car. The logic is simple. If you build a beautiful, fast car that no one can buy, some of that excitement might trickle down to the person buying a base model Neon. But as the crowd looked closer, something felt different about the ME412. It didn't have the typical exaggerated lines of a concept car. It looked much more mechanical and ready for production. The question that people had was not how fast the car was, but rather, why did Chrysler do this? Chrysler was currently in the middle of a massive high-stakes merger with Daimler-Benz, the parent company of Mercedes. The corporate mission was supposed to be about unity, cost-cutting, and shared labs. But a bespoke, world-beating supercar felt like the total opposite of every corporate directive coming out of the headquarters. On the surface, it looked like a desperate grab for attention. But as the technical details began to leak out, it became clear that this wasn't an average concept. Chrysler had built a car despite that their corporate structure did not allow it. The story of the ME412 starts at its own name. It stands for mid-engine, 4 turbos, 12 cylinders. The heart of the car was a 6.0-litre V12 engine. Because of the merger with Daimler, Chrysler had access to the Mercedes-Benz parts bin, and that's where the skepticism started. The initial narrative was that Chrysler had simply taken a regular AMG engine, slapped some turbos on it, and called it a day. The critics argued that this wasn't really a Chrysler, but more of Mercedes in a costume. However, the engineering reality told a much more complex story. While the engine block came from the Mercedes M120 family, the engineers at the Skunk Works division of Chrysler, which is the same division that developed the Viper, had essentially redesigned everything around it. They built a unique quad turbocharged system that required an entirely new intake and exhaust. To manage the heat and the massive airflow required for 850 horsepower, they had to engineer a complicated cooling system that used high-capacity heat exchangers and specific airflow channels built into the bodywork. Then came the chassis. Unlike almost everything else in the Chrysler catalogue, the ME412 didn't use a traditional steel frame. It was built around a carbon fibre and aluminium honeycomb monocoque. This is a construction method usually reserved for Formula One cars or high-end exotics like the Ferrari Enzo. It was incredibly light and incredibly stiff. The transmission was another indicator that this wasn't a parts bin project. They used a 7-speed dual clutch transmission developed by Ricardo, the same firm that would later develop the gearboxes for Bugatti and McLaren. In 2004, dual clutch technology was still in its infancy for road cars. This was literally a push toward the absolute frontier of what was possible. But the most shocking part of this engineering story was the timeline. Most car manufacturers take 4 to 5 years to go from a sketch to a functional prototype. The ME412 team did it in less than 12 months, producing a functional prototype with a theoretical top speed of 248 miles an hour. They had created a running machine in a fraction of the time it took the parent company to refresh a dashboard on a Mercedes C-Class. This speed suggested something much more than just a marketing stunt. It suggested a team of engineers who were working with a sense of urgency, as if they knew they were running out of time. By the summer of 2004, the ME412 moved from the show floor to the track, and specifically, it went to Laguna Seca. To understand the significance of this car, we have to look at what the best cars in the world were at that moment. This was the era of the holy trinity of the early 2000s. The Ferrari Enzo, the Porsche Carrera GT, and the Mercedes SLR McLaren. These were the titans. They were the cars that every enthusiast pinned to their wall. The Ferrari Enzo produced 651 horsepower. The Porsche Carrera GT produced 603. The Mercedes SLR McLaren, the flagship of Chrysler's own parent company, produced 617. The Chrysler ME412 produced 850 horsepower. But horsepower is only half of the story in engineering. The other half is weight. The Ferrari Enzo weighed roughly 3,200 pounds. The Mercedes SLR was a heavy Grand Tourer at nearly 3,800 pounds. Thanks to its carbon fibre tub, the Chrysler weighed just under 2,900 pounds. On paper, the math was devastating. The ME412 had a power-to-weight ratio that didn't just beat the competition, it existed in a different category entirely. Its projected 0 to 60 time was 2.9 seconds. Its calculated top speed was 248 miles per hour. For context, the McLaren F1, which had held the top speed record for a decade, topped out at 240. When the car arrived at Laguna Seca for testing, it wasn't just a straight-line car, it wasn't a muscle car. The test drivers found that the structural rigidity of the carbon tub and the aerodynamics provided by the massive rear diffuser and active spoiler made it incredibly stable in corners. The cooling systems, which often fail on high-horsepower concept cars, held up under intense track usage. The engineers had accomplished the impossible. They had built a car that was objectively faster, lighter, and more technologically advanced than the world's most prestigious supercars. And they had done it under the brand name usually associated with minivans and mid-sized sedans. This created a massive problem. In the automotive industry, performance creates a hierarchy. You are supposed to get what you pay for. A Ferrari is supposed to be faster than a Maserati. A Mercedes is supposed to be more advanced than a Chrysler. The ME412 had broken the hierarchy. It was a glitch in the automotive matrix. If you don't want to miss out on anything cars, make sure to subscribe. As the testing results became public, the conversation shifted from wondering if they could build such a car to wondering if they should sell such a car. Chrysler's leadership began talking about a production run. They estimated they could sell the ME412 for somewhere between $250,000 and $750,000. On the surface, the business case looked difficult. Chrysler didn't have the infrastructure to service carbon fibre supercars. Their dealerships weren't equipped to host the kind of high net worth individuals who buy $500,000 cars. This is the brand dilution argument. The theory is that a brand is a promise. If you buy a Chrysler, you are buying into a promise of American value and reliability. If you put that same badge on a supercar, you confuse the market. Would a billionaire really want to see a Chrysler badge in their garage next to their Pagani? And would a family buying a Voyager minivan feel alienated by a brand that spent millions on a car they could never afford? Daimler Chrysler's board of directors used these economic arguments to cast doubt on the project. They pointed to the development costs. Even though the prototype was functional, turning it into a mass production vehicle that met global safety and emission standards would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. In a merger that was already becoming strained by culture clashes and financial pressure, the ME412 was painted as an expensive ego project. The rational decision, according to the board, was to kill the project and focus on high-volume vehicles that would actually turn a profit. They argued that Chrysler simply didn't have the pedigree to compete at this level. The project was officially mothballed in 2005. The official reason given to the public was that the cost of production was too high and the market for supercars was too small. It was framed as a sensible corporate correction. The grown-ups had entered the room and stopped the engineers from spending too much money on a toy. For years, that was the accepted story. It was a victim of bad timing and a difficult merger. But if you look closer at the internal politics of Daimler Chrysler, at that exact moment, a much more uncomfortable truth begins to emerge. The ME412 wasn't cancelled because Chrysler couldn't make it work. It was cancelled because it worked too well. At the exact same time Chrysler was testing the ME412, Mercedes was launching their own flagship, the SLR McLaren. The SLR was the pride of Germany. It was the result of a partnership between Mercedes and one of the most successful Formula One teams in history. It was meant to be the ultimate expression of German engineering and prestige. It cost nearly $450,000, but the Chrysler was still better. It was faster. It was lighter. It was more advanced in its construction. And perhaps most embarrassingly, it used a version of a Mercedes engine to beat the Mercedes. The merger of equals between Daimler and Chrysler was, in reality, a takeover. The hierarchy was clear. Mercedes was the premium, superior brand, and Chrysler was the blue-collar, volume brand. This wasn't just a marketing preference, it was the literal architecture of the entire company. If Chrysler were allowed to release the ME412, the corporate hierarchy would have collapsed. How could Mercedes justify the price and prestige of the SLR McLaren if their budget American subsidiary was selling a car that could outrun it for potentially less money? It would have been a humiliation for the engineers in Stuttgart. It would have proved that the Americans, using borrowed German parts and a fraction of the budget, had actually built a superior machine. The ME412 was a threat to the ego of the parent company. The project wasn't killed by accountants. It was killed by the politics of prestige. The car had to die because its existence proved that the merger of equals was a lie. In a true merger of equals, the best engineering would win, regardless of which side of the ocean it came from. But in a hierarchy, the subordinate is not allowed to be better than the master. When the ME412 was wheeled into a museum, it wasn't a symbol of Chrysler's failure. It was a symbol of their peak competence. The engineers had followed the instructions too perfectly. They had used the synergies of the merger to create something world-class, only to realise that the company they worked for didn't actually want them to be the best. They wanted them to stay in their place. The car stands today as a reminder that in the world of big business, innovation is often secondary to the preservation of the brand hierarchy. Chrysler proved they could build the best car in the world, and for the people in charge, that was the biggest mistake they could have made. Don't forget to subscribe to not miss anything cars and business.